The next hidden habit is called break the jar. Hidden habit number 5, break the jar. When I was a kid, we used to go to the mall, and we had to walk through Dillard's to get to the other stores because of where we always parked at the mall in Manhattan, Kansas. But one of my favorite things to do was I would take some women's perfume samples from the countertop, and I would break them open, and throughout our trip to the mall, I would secretly wipe them on my brother. And by the time we got back to the car, he was so mad because he smelled like Liz Claiborne. It was great. Well, how would you feel if somebody put perfume on you? Mark chapter 14, verse 3. This is the hidden habit of breaking the jar. Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon, a man who previously had leprosy. When he was eating, a woman came in with a beautiful alabaster jar of expensive perfume made of essence of nard. She broke open the jar and poured the perfume over his head. Some of the people at the table were indignant. "Why would you waste such expensive perfume?" they asked. "It could have been sold for a year's wages and the money given to the poor." So they scolded her harshly, but Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. Why would you criticize her for doing such a good thing to me? You will always have the poor among you, and you can help them whenever you want, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could and has anointed my body for burial ahead of time. I tell you the truth, wherever good news is preached throughout the world, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went to the leading priests to arrange to betray Jesus to them. What an amazing story. This woman comes into a party and takes this incredibly expensive jar, and she breaks it and pours it on Jesus' head. This jar, they said, was worth a year's salary. And this woman is totally disregarding of the cost of this act of love. This woman recognized what was going to happen to Jesus because it says, this is what you would do to bodies for burial. And when all the disciples were waiting for Jesus to lead a revolution, this woman saw Jesus. And she recognized, she saw him in a way that nobody else at that party saw him. When everybody else wanted something from Jesus, this woman was the only one at this party that wanted something for Jesus. And because of what she did in that moment, because she broke the jar, Jesus said what she's done will never be forgotten. This hidden habit is not about giving money, by the way. In fact, I would say it's almost rarely about giving money. This is about over-the-top acts of love that we do for people every single day. How often is our financial generosity just a way of avoiding actually seeing and caring for people and what they really need? Years ago, I had about $25,000 of student loan debt, and my friend, he told me this years later, my friend was about to write a check to pay it off because he just sold his company for $3.7 million. And he was about to write a check to pay off my student loans, but he said something held him back. And the next couple years, I struggled, and I budgeted, and I figured out how to do it, and I paid off my student loans. And when my friend told me that, I told him, thank you. Thank you for loving me enough not to write me a check so that I had to learn this the correct way, because I would never have learned these lessons. Thank you for seeing what I actually needed. So my question for you is, who has broken the jar for you? Who has done an act of love in your life that you never forgot? That's what breaking the jar means. Do you know their names? I know their names of people in my life that have broken the jar for me. Do you want to do things for people that they never forget? What would it be like to make a memory in someone's life that they looked back on as a time where they actually felt seen and loved and they never forget it? What would a life look like that was lived that way every single day, of making a habit of breaking the jar for people? How do you break the jar? The first way to do it is you listen deeply to people. Become a noticer. Whenever people say something to you, ask, what's the subtext here? What's the cry of the heart underneath? What's the real longing here? There was a guy at a church. I was preaching at a church in college in Topeka. And there was a guy that said, let me take you to lunch afterwards. And he drove me over to this restaurant. And then he took me to the mall. We walked into the mall, and we were in the suit section. And he says, I want you to pick out a suit. And I was like, are you kidding me? And this guy bought me a suit because he said every preacher needs to have a suit. And he paid and he bought me a suit. He broke the jar for me. To break the jar, you need to be a good watcher. You need to be a good listener. You need to notice what people really care about and what they need, and you need to be ready to act. Jesus only needed this perfume in this one moment. And this woman saw the opportunity and broke the jar. If you're not ready to care for others at a moment's notice, you might miss the opportunity. I love the story. Years ago, the preacher Tony Campolo tells a story about how when he was preaching at a conference in Honolulu, Hawaii, and he could not sleep at night, so he woke up. And he decided he was going to go find some food, and he stumbled into this greasy diner. He said it was so dirty, he didn't even want to touch the menu. And he ordered coffee and a donut, and he's sitting there drinking his coffee and donut, and suddenly in walks about 20 prostitutes, in this little diner in Honolulu in the middle of the night. And he's sitting there, and he notices this conversation going on amongst these women, and one of them, her name is Agnes. She said, "It's my birthday today." And all the other ladies just kind of make fun of her and yell at her. And Tony Campolo is touched by this. And so he approaches this big guy behind the counter. His name's Harry. And he says, "You know what? I'd like to do something. Do these women come in here every single night?" And he says, "Every night at 3 a.m. on the dot, they show up." And he says, "I would like to throw a birthday party for Agnes tomorrow night." And this guy is like touched by this. So he says, "I think that's a great idea." So the next night, they decorate this entire diner with decorations. And here's what he writes. The woman who did the cooking must have gotten the word out on the street because by 3:15 a.m., every prostitute in Honolulu was in the place. He says it was wall-to-wall prostitutes and me, the preacher. At 3:30 on the dot, the door of the diner swung open, and in came Agnes and her friend. I had everybody ready. After all, I was kind of the MC of the affair. And when they came in, we all screamed, "Happy birthday." Excuse me. He said, "Never have I seen a person so flabbergasted, so shocked." Her mouth fell open, her legs buckled, her friend grabbed her arm to steady her, and as she was led to sit on one of the stools at the counter, we all sang happy birthday to her. As we came to the end of our singing, the cake was brought out with the candles, and her eyes moistened, and when the birthday cake came out, she openly cried. As we were about to cut the cake, she said, "You know what? Could I take this cake home with me? Nobody has ever made me a birthday cake in my life." And she left the diner, promising to return. And Tony Campolo says there was a shocked silence that filled that diner. And not knowing what else to do, he said, "Well, what do you say we pray for Agnes?" And so he led a prayer with all these prostitutes at 3:30 in the morning. And then when he got done, the owner of the diner said to him, "You didn't tell me you were a preacher. What kind of church do you go to?" And Tony Campolo says, "I go to a church that throws birthday parties for prostitutes at 3:30 in the morning." And the guy said, "No, you don't, because if you did, if that church existed, I would go to that church." May you always find ways to break the jar in your life.